I believe that military families kind of live behind a veil of secrecy. There are things that we know that goes on in our family, and we don't share those things. And when my father came home from World War II, he never talked about the war. Now and then he'd spool out bits and pieces of scary story, kind of like machine gun fire in a way. And then he'd abruptly stop. And he did not really explain anything to anyone, but we felt this deep wound that he carried. And he really struggled with PTSD before it was called that. And we knew his soul was wounded and he had experienced a lot of trauma. We felt it. We didn't know it intellectually, but we felt it.
Welcome to Linda's Corner, where we bring more hope, healing, and happiness to the world. My name is Linda Bjork, and today we're going to be talking about healing from generational trauma. I'm delighted to welcome Becky Ellis. Becky has spent over 20 years in the publishing industry. She is the author of Little Avalanches and the daughter of a highly decorated World War II combat sergeant. You can reach Becky at her website, beckyellis.net, and I'll include that link in the show notes. Welcome, Becky. I'm so glad that you could join with me today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.
Oh, and I am excited for this conversation. And there's one more piece of your introduction that I didn't say because I want you to be able to explain it. And that is that you are a timber wolf pup. And some people, when they hear that, they'll say, oh, that is so cool. And other people will say, I don't get it. So can you explain what that means?
Most people will say, I don't get it, because the Timberwolves are a division of the Army. They are the 104th Infantry Division, and their offspring are called the Timberwolf pups. So there are quite a few of us around, and that's what a Timberwolf pup is. It's anyone who had a father or uncle as a Timberwolf or grandfather. Yeah.
That is so awesome. And that is important for background information, that we understand that you are in a military family, that your father served in World War II, because this is part of the underlying of your story. So do you want to kind of explain what kind of things can happen as after the war is over? We think once the war is over and people come home that it's all done. And yet it isn't.
Right. It is absolutely not. And there's not a lot written about this. There's not a lot shared about this, because I believe that military families kind of live behind a veil of secrecy. There are things that we know that goes on in our family, and we don't share those things. And when my father came home from World War II, he never talked about the war. Now and then he'd spool out bits and pieces of scary story, kind of like machine gun fire in a way. And then he'd abruptly stop. And he did not really explain anything to anyone, but we felt this deep wound that he carried. And he really struggled with PTSD before it was called that. And we knew his soul was wounded and he had experienced a lot of trauma. We felt it. We didn't know it intellectually, but we felt it. So I think a lot of military families deal with that. They deal with trying to reckon with someone's experience, their trauma that they incurred either in war or in military service. And military service, a lot of people think, is 4 years and then you're done. But I think people that choose to sign up for the military, whether they know it or not, and I believe most don't realize it, they're trading a normal life for a life they couldn't have imagined. Don't think it's imaginable to know what you're going to go through when you join the military.
And I think that's important to understand. And I hope that because time has passed since your father served, that there are some better understanding. Like you said, PTSD wasn't even understood. And so everyone assumed that you just go home and it's over. And they didn't understand that you carry these wounds with you. And there wasn't really anybody to talk to because no one else understood either. Whereas now people understand more that we carry these things. And when you're in our normal day to day and we live in stress where, I got to go to work and I've got to take my kids here and I've got to do this, we think we're stressed. We think, I don't know what we think, but everything is so normal. And when you're taken out of that situation, and we're not talking military drills or training, but actual combat, where all of the rules of our day to day living, our interaction between you and me, would be completely different if you and I were on different sides of a war. And so it's almost like all of our normal social and acceptable rules are changed, where instead of we protect each other, or we certainly don't hurt each other, you're in a situation where you must protect yourself. And you also are in actively trying to destroy an enemy. It's so different. I think for most of us who have not had that experience, it's kind of hard to really comprehend.
Well, it was hard for me to comprehend growing up with my father because I didn't experience combat. And glad you mentioned that because I want to say that at the outset. The information that I have, the understanding that I have, comes from a conversation I had with my father toward the end of his life. When he turned 89, he opened up to me and told me all about his time in combat. And we talked for a very long time about it, for a few years about it, so I could gain an understanding of his experience. So everything I'm telling you about combat experience comes from my father and what he tried his best to convey to me. And something that you said about taken out of our normal lives and now being able to share with others maybe what that experience was like. It's a survival skill when you're in combat to turn your emotions off. My father told me over and over, they were trained to be dehumanized. And it's so horrible, yet utterly important for survival. You cannot feel when you're running into machine gun fire. You cannot feel when you're doing the killing that is required that you do. You have to turn it off. You have to have no emotion around it at all. And I think that's one of the really difficult things is then you're, dropped back into civilian life and you're expected just to start feeling again. But they carry this weight of what they've experienced. And it's not a switch you can flip. Living with my father felt like he would flip a switch from being emotional and loving and caring and then not emotional at all, like having no feeling at all. And I think it's really difficult for anybody who experiences combat and to live with somebody. The other thing that's really not talked about is how this affects families and children and how that's actually passed on through generations to other children. This trauma that's brought home from war.
And that conversation that you had with your father that started at 89, was there something, did you ask him to tell you, or was he just ready to talk?
Well, he came to my home and asked if we had any issues to clear up. And it's a little bit laughable because my father had 4 wives and 8 children. And, I grew up in the 1970s. And while other kids were learning to roller skate and listening to disco, I was learning to shoot a gun and getting my teeth drilled without Novocaine and all sorts of things. These are in my memoir, these scenarios and scenes. And we had a lot of issues to clear up because, like I said, my father wouldn't talk about anything. He wouldn't talk about something that happened 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago. The past he was not going to talk about the past, which he would not talk about the war. So when he came to me and said, do we have any issues? Even as a child, I felt this weight that he carried. And I wanted to understand what had happened to him. And I asked him, I said, I want to know about the war. And in his typical style, he said, all you need to know about the war is my feet were frozen for 172 days. And he was in the European theater and fought through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. And I said, I'm sure there's more, Dad. And so it took a lot of coaxing and a lot of persistence. My father raised me in his manner. And, they say veteran father, warrior daughter. And so I was as persistent with him wanting to understand and get him talking as he had been with me my whole life. So after a few hours, he opened up and started sharing.
That's beautiful. So you are his warrior daughter, and you have been trained and prepared. And what's one of the things that we're going to talk about, and I kind of want to start there now, is having these hard conversations that nobody wants to have actually brings about good. Because I think it matters very much that we understand that something good can come out of it, that something better. Like I'm imagining I'm in your shoes and things don't feel quite right. I can feel that there's a weight. I know that information is being withheld from me. I have a father who's, not letting me roller skate. Instead, I'm doing weird stuff. And I hope that at some point things can be better. Now, from your father's perspective, he went through something horrible, something that he never could have imagined, didn't ask for, didn't want, but did. Because he did what he was required to do. And now in your mind, when you're free from something horrible, you just want to put your blinders on and say, I just want to pretend that that never happened. I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to remember it. So now I have this warrior daughter who's asking me to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to go there again. So, in order to help people have the courage to talk about it, we've got to believe that if I can get this out and heal from it, then it will get better, that it will be better than it is when I'm trying to hold it inside. Is it okay if we talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. I think that we are profoundly shaped by the secrets that we keep. And I think we're forever changed by the stories that we share. And it is really difficult to talk about. I think that it requires a lot of awareness of how, a lot of gentleness, a lot of tenderness to talk about the hard things. And I think that most families, not only military families, most families have something, and everybody knows what the thing is that's not being talked about. And it is really difficult, but everybody knows what it is. And there are much more gentle ways in than from a warrior daughter, pushing a veteran father. There are kind ways in, there are gentle ways in to the conversation. And I think people are much better off after having the discussion. And I also want to acknowledge that a lot of times people aren't willing or it's not safe to have a conversation with somebody. And though that's difficult too. It was safe to have a conversation with my father, but it was safe when he was 89. It was not safe when he was 50. So
We're going to expound on that too. But in, can you tell me anything about your father before and after this conversation? Was he happier? Did he feel lighter? Did you feel more connected? Was there something, a benefit that you could see for him after he shared his story?
My father never wore anything military. He wouldn't wear a pin or a t-shirt or a hat. And about 9 months into my conversation with him, he started wearing a World War II veteran hat
Yeah.
with all of his medals on it. And I picked him up at the airport one time, and this is in my book. I picked him up at the airport and he had this World War II veteran hat on with all 13 medals, the little ribbons from them. And I thought, what on earth has happened to you? Have you lost your mind? Because my father wouldn't join a military organization or a veterans group. He wouldn't go to the VA. He wanted nothing to do with that. That was something that happened and he wanted it as far away from him as possible. And he started wearing this hat. And he changed profoundly, I think. And I think it's something that he needed to reckon with in his life. I think he carried the survivor's guilt to his last breath. I really do believe that. And he didn't fully heal. I'm not sure he ever could have, but I definitely witnessed in him a softening and an acceptance in the way he could talk about it, which was a beautiful thing. And for me, it was profoundly healing for me as his daughter. And I think he witnessed that too. And one of the biggest parts of that was there are things that we need from our parents. We need them to take care of us. We need them to be safe. We need to be sheltered and fed as children. And then when we grow up, we still want to be loved by them. Every woman wants to be loved by her father. And I didn't really see my father separate from myself because I didn't know him outside the context of being my father. I didn't know about his past. And once I understood his past and he had this whole life, intellectually, I knew he had a whole life separate from me. I knew he was in a war. I knew he had a wife and 3 children before I came into the picture, but I couldn't really see him as separate from myself. And he reached a moment in his story that was so unimaginable and so horrible that I suddenly saw him for the man that he was, not the father I wanted him to be or the grandpa I wanted him to be or what I needed him to be, but completely separate from myself. And I think it's really rare that we see our parents or our children or our partners completely apart from our own desires or needs. And that felt like one of the most healing moments for me is that I could see him as someone completely apart from me. And all the things that had happened, they didn't have to do with me. They had to do with his experience. And having that experience with my father, seeing him as separate, I was able to start seeing my children in that way too, as apart and separate from my desires. They didn't have my experience. They weren't raised with the childhood I was raised with. So they didn't really understand some of my rules as a parent. And once I had this moment with my father and I saw him completely apart from myself and was able to see my children with their own experience, not mine shadowed on it, I understood them better too. It was really beautiful. And I wish everybody could have the experience of that because that was probably one of the most healing moments that I had.
Wow. And I've never really thought of it that way before, as seeing our parents as separate beings, meaning your life that doesn't include me, that you are my parent. You are also a person. And it's interesting when we have family relationships. I mean, sometimes we have more compassion and patience for our friends and our neighbors than we do for our family members because we have a different expectation. You are my fill in the blank. You are my child. You are my father. You are my whatever. And I expect you to do this. And I would love and to talk more about having someone and seeing them and accepting them for who they are, not what we want them to be or what we need them to be. I think sometimes we're disappointed, not necessarily with what someone does, but that it doesn't match what I wanted. That this is what I wanted. You're not being what I wanted. You're not giving me what I wanted. And so it hurts with this unmet expectation. And maybe our expectations really aren't very fair.
Yeah, maybe they're not. And I don't think we need to change our expectations or lower our expectations, but the ability to see someone apart from yourself, like you said, neighbors and friends, we don't have the needs or desires from them that we have for our own family because we're so enmeshed in our own families. And when you have a partner and you raise children, you do need things from them. And we do need things from our parents. We need to have our basic needs met. But when we become adults, you know, we might not need those things anymore. And they're so patterned in us. When my father would come to visit, I'd take him to grandparents' day at my children's school. And I have 3 daughters. And I would want him to dress a certain way and say the right thing and act the right way. But he was such an unpredictable man that I was always terrified that he would say something that would shame me or embarrass my children. And when I saw him apart from myself, I realized what he does doesn't really impact me. It's who he is. It's not a reflection on me. And I could really let a lot of that go. And I don't want to make it sound like it's easy. It took a lot of consciousness to say, okay, dad's doing this, and it's okay. He's being him. And it's not me. I'm not saying that. I am not doing that. Yes, he is my father. Yes, he has that title. And he is who he is based on his experience, not based on mine. And this came up, I will say, this came up with my daughter when she got a tattoo. And I did not want my children. I think tattoos are fine. I think they're fine. I live in Portland, Oregon. Every other person has a tattoo. Some of them are super cool, but I didn't want my children to have tattoos. And it has to do with something that happened in my own childhood that had to do with needles and was really unpleasant. And that was my experience, though. I had an unpleasant experience with needles. My children didn't. And once I could put that together and say, that was my experience. I didn't raise my children in the same household I was raised in. It was a much more caring, nurturing place. They're having their own life experience, and a tattoo to them is really different than it is to me. And I need to let them be who they are. It's really hard to do, especially as a mom or a parent. But knowing that, and, it took a few conversations with my daughter and I, tearful, crying. But in the end, when we could really talk about, oh, this is where my belief came from. And she would look at me and say, well, I didn't have that experience. Oh, that's right. You didn't have that experience. You didn't have a bad experience. And so this isn't bad for you. It's hurtful for me. I don't want to get one, but this is you. It's tough. It's not easy, but I think it's so important. It's like the same thing with the conversations. It was a hard conversation to have with her, and I didn't get it right at first. They're messy, and we're going to get them wrong. They're going to go sideways, but to just keep coming back to them in a kind and loving way, I think is the goal. To stick with it, I think is the goal.
I love that. Thank you so much for sharing. And as you're explaining things, it's like, yeah, been there, done that. My daughter also has tattoos, and she thinks of it very differently than I do about it. And to be able to let go and say, you're an adult, you get to choose for you. My role of being able to, as a parent, say yes and no ended. And so now my job is to love. And that is the part of being a parent that continues with you. I also loved when you mentioned we don't have to get it right the first time. We have to try. And I appreciate you including that, because I think a lot of our conversations, especially when we're in new territory, we don't get it right. And sometimes when we don't get it right, we just want to say, oh, well, I'm not going to do that again. I'm not making that mistake again. When maybe it opened a door to a future conversation that we can do better. And it's
Right.
okay to make mistakes, as in families, as parents, as children, as whatever. We're going to make mistakes.
Right.
And that's okay.
And one of the most powerful things I have learned to do with my family and with people when I'm going into territory where I know it's going to be a hard conversation for me, I don't know what it's going to be like for them, but for me, is to start by saying, there's something I want to say, and I don't quite know how to say it. So it might come out sideways. So will you please just bear with me? It's being vulnerable.
Okay.
Like,
can we repeat that? Because that is key. You just gave a safety net so that when I make a mistake, I'll be able to, hopefully the person I'm talking to is going to have a little more compassion with me. And I am going to be able to take the next step. So you say that again. Here I am. We're about to have a conversation. You have something to tell me that probably I don't want to hear. So to get me prepped, you're going to say,
and I just made it up, but also probably isn't going to be exactly the same. But I will say something like, there's something that I want to talk about, and I don't know how to do that, but I want to try, and it might come out sideways. So please bear with me. And then I start,
okay. And
yeah.
that was beautiful. And the way you said that didn't make my shields go up, because you didn't say, I'm about to say something that you don't want to hear because I'm about to tell you how horrible you are. You said right up front, I have something to tell you that I might not get right. So now, instead of my shields going up saying, oh my gosh, Becky's going to rake me over the coals, I've got to prepare my defenses, it will be, oh, this is something that's hard for you. So I'm going to try to listen and I'm going to try to have an open mind so that I can hear what you have to say. And it even gives me an opening where I can say, I don't like the presentation. Can we turn it? It gives me some power to maybe tweak things a little bit. Has that ever
Hmm.
happened?
I think so. And I think just saying there's something I want to say and I don't know how to do it is, I think that's disarming. It's admitting vulnerability, it's admitting lack of practice, it's admitting I don't know how to do this thing and I really want to do it. And so it suddenly creates vulnerability. And I think that when you approach a conversation from a place of vulnerability, it's very disarming. And I think that is key in having these difficult conversations.
And I love the word disarming. So my mental picture is my shields are up, my weapons are up because I must protect myself. And now you're saying, here I am, and I've put my weapons down. I've put my shields down, and I'm going to be real. And that gives an invitation for me to also put my mental and emotional weapons down, my shields down, and to allow to be rather than just to protect, because that comes so instinctively.
Right. It does. We all live behind so much armor, and it's so difficult to break through that in oneself. When I was talking to my father and he was telling me his story, there were times when I had to defend myself against it because some of it was so awful and horrible. But really, what was happening was it was breaking through to me. And it was breaking my heart over and over and over again until my heart was just shattered. And it was, in a sense, opened by that. And I try to live with an open heart now. And it's really hard because I think as a culture, we are constantly defending ourselves. But to live in an open hearted, vulnerable way is scary.
Yeah.
It's really scary, but it's worth it. I think it's so worth it.
And the image in my mind as I'm putting myself in your shoes, I'm listening to this story that is so horrible that even though I'm not living it, hearing about it is breaking my heart. And then to recognize that someone that I love, that I care about, lived through this, experienced it, where even hearing about it is excruciating and heartbreaking. And then that, I don't know, I think it increases compassion for, wow, I can't even imagine how hard it would be to carry that weight for decades when I'm dealing with it for moments and it's killing me.
Right. And it's not just compassion for those that we love. It increases compassion, I think, for everybody. I think it really taps into our humanity. And anybody, people I don't know who've been through that, I have deep compassion for it.
Wow. So to
Yeah.
go from a place of survival, which is our normal, let's get through this, to a place of humanity and connection, that to me seems like a goal worth working toward. Something that makes going through the hard things of having a conversation, of seeing someone's soul, it's worth it.
Absolutely. It is. And there's this saying about, people just want to be seen and heard. And I think it goes a step beyond that. I think people want to be felt. And I think the true healing happens when it's not when I see you seeing me, it's when I feel you feeling me. And I know when I was talking to my father, I felt his pain. And I think that was where the healing happened is he felt me feeling him. And that is so much more powerful than being seen. We talk about being seen a lot. I think we all need to take it a step further and we need to start feeling each other. And it's really hard. It kind of brings tears to my eyes right now because my dad went through hell and to feel that it's hard, but I think it makes us all feel less alone when we can feel each other. And
Mm.
it takes it to a whole new level.
And I imagine he felt alone for a very long time. When you feel like I'm not seen, I'm not heard, I'm not felt, no one understands.
Right. And I do believe it's really difficult to understand. And I know a lot of veterans feel like, and people of trauma of any kind feel like nobody can possibly understand. And that might be true, but we can feel them. Whether we can understand or not, we can feel it. If we can open ourselves up to that and we can be present to that and just be with it.
Mm. Wow. Now, this has been beautiful. Becky, is there anything you want to make sure that we cover before we close today?
Not that I can think of. I think that it takes a lot of practice also. I would like to say that. I think that the conversations take practice. I think feeling other people, opening our own selves up to that, it takes practice. Probably a lifetime of practice. I think it's something I'll be practicing for the rest of my life. And one thing, I wrote a book called Little Avalanches, and it's a memoir. And the thing about memoir is it's really well, adults take in memoir like children take in fairy tales, and that's as psychological practice. And the reason I wrote the book that I wrote, which is about my childhood, my father's experience, and the conversation we had at the end of his life, was to offer that type of practice for feeling humanity and feeling compassion, and to kind of confront our own capacity for suffering and compassion. And I think that's important to practice.
Beautiful thing. So, as we require practice in order to do a good job, and we can get some of that practice vicariously through reading and understanding someone else's story. So, if I'm in a situation like Becky's, where I feel like I need to have some difficult conversations, I can read the book and get some practice in a totally safe place. It doesn't hurt me at all. I haven't actually made any mistakes yet. And I can get some practice so that when it's my turn to say those words, I have something I need to talk about. And I'm not really sure how to do it. So please bear with me as I try. It'll be a little bit easier than it would be if I just started out cold. Thank you.
Exactly. And it's not, my memoir is about something specific. It is about having hard conversations. It is about generational trauma. There are other people with other types of trauma, and there are other memoirs that delve into that. And if that's what listeners need practice with, like find a memoir that, kind of is about what you're struggling with, I think is super helpful.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thank you,
Yeah.
Becky.
Thank you.
In closing, I'd like to share a quote from Susan Forward. She said, "The family drama may look and sound different from generation to generation, but all toxic patterns are remarkably similar in their outcome: pain and suffering." Today, I invite any of our listeners who are suffering from generational trauma to break the cycle and heal the pain and suffering. See you next time on Linda's Corner. Thanks for listening. Please share and subscribe to help us reach new listeners. And if you'd like to heal your life from the inside out, there is a free video series at hopeforhealingfoundation.org. Just click on the Free Stuff tab. I also invite you to grab a copy of one of my books, like Crushed, A Journey Through Depression, and You Got This, an action plan to calm fear, anxiety, worry, and stress. See you next time on Linda's Corner.